Good evening, friends. Ready for 5 more spine-chilling real horror stories? I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Drop a comment below. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and leave a like. It helps me bring more dark tales to you. Now put on your headphones or settle in front of your TV and let's dive into the fear. I was being watched. I didn't know by who or for how long, but the feeling was undeniable. Someone had been following me. It started with small things. A lingering presence in the parking lot at night, the sensation of eyes crawling over me as I walked to my car. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia. I worked grueling night shifts at St. Augustine Medical Center in Oregon, and exhaustion had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But then I found the note. It was a cold October morning, just past 5:30 a.m., and I was leaving the hospital after a brutal overnight shift. The sky was still dark, the parking lot nearly empty, except for the silhouettes of cars lined up like tombstones. As I approached my car, something fluttered against the windshield, a small slip of paper damp from the misty air. I frowned, peeling it off. "You are beautiful when you're tired." I froze. My exhaustion was suddenly replaced by something far worse. A deep, twisting unease. I scanned the lot, my breath shallow. The few remaining cars were lifeless, their windows reflecting only the dim glow of the overhead lights. No movement, no sign of anyone. My skin crawled as I unlocked my car with shaking fingers, locking the doors the second I was inside. It had to be a joke. Maybe a coworker messing with me. I shoved the note into the glove compartment and drove home, telling myself it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. A few days later, there was another note. This time, it was worse. "I love your dimple when you smile. Smile for me." My stomach twisted. The words weren't just creepy, they were personal. This wasn't some random prank. Whoever was leaving these notes had been watching me closely, memorizing details about my face, my expressions. I wanted to believe it was some misguided secret, admirer, but deep down I knew better. There was a hunger in those words, an obsession that sent a cold wave of terror through my veins. That night, I asked one of my coworkers, Ben, to walk me to my car. He laughed at first, but when he saw my face, his expression turned serious. "You're sure it's not just some guy from the hospital?" he asked as we stepped into the nearly abandoned parking lot. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I have this feeling, like I'm being hunted." Ben glanced around before shaking his head. "I'll walk you out from now on, okay? Just to be safe." I nodded, relieved, but as I unlocked my car, I felt it again. That invisible pressure, the weight of unseen eyes drilling into my back. And for the first time, I wondered, what if they weren't just watching? What if they were waiting? For a while, I thought maybe it had stopped. No more notes. No strange feelings in the parking lot. Maybe Ben walking me to my car had scared them off. I was wrong. The silence wasn't safety. It was the calm before the storm. 2 weeks later, I left the hospital just after midnight, stepping into the cold, empty lot. The wind howled between the cars, carrying the scent of rain and gasoline. Ben wasn't with me that night. He had called in sick. But I told myself it was fine. I just needed to get to my car. That's when I saw it, a single white flower, placed neatly on my windshield. My breath hitched. My blood ran ice cold. This wasn't just a note. It was a message. A gift. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in, my chest. My fingers trembled as I reached for the flower, but something in my peripheral vision stopped me. A figure. Standing just beyond the reach of the parking lot lights, half hidden behind a row of cars. Watching me. I couldn't see his face, only the outline of his body, tall, motionless, his head tilted slightly as if he was studying me. The air turned thick, suffocating. My pulse pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to bolt back inside, but something primal told me not to move too fast. Don't show fear. Don't let him know how terrified you are. Slowly, carefully, I backed toward my car, never breaking eye contact with the figure. My hands fumbled for my keys, shaking so violently I could barely grip them. Click. The sound of my car unlocking felt deafening in the dead silence of the lot. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and slammed the lock shut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, afraid to look in the mirrors. Afraid that if I did, I'd see him standing right behind my car. I turned the key. The engine sputtered. No, not now. I twisted it again, harder. The car roared to life. I threw it into reverse and sped out of the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. My breath came in ragged gasps as I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. I drove home too fast, barely stopping at red lights. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked every door, shut every curtain, and sat in the dark, gripping a kitchen knife like a lifeline. I didn't sleep that night, and when the sun rose, I realized something that made my stomach churn. The Thorus was a white lily, a funeral flower, whoever he was. He wasn't just watching me, he was planning something. I didn't go back to work for 3 days. I told my boss I was sick, but the truth was I was afraid, terrified. I barely left my apartment, barely slept. Every sound outside made my pulse spike. Every shadow felt wrong, but I couldn't hide forever. By the 4th night, I forced myself back into my routine. I told myself maybe it was over. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe whoever left the notes and the flower had moved on. But I was wrong. That night, I finished my shift around 2 a.m. I hesitated at the exit doors, my stomach twisting into knots. The hospital was silent. The halls stretched into eerie emptiness, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. I pulled my jacket tight around me and stepped outside. The parking lot was a vast, open graveyard of cars, the cold air slicing through my skin. I walked quickly, my keys gripped so tight in my fist that they bit into my palm. And then, I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Not distant. Close. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch movement in my peripheral vision. A dark shape slipping between the parked cars, keeping pace with me. He's here. Panic clawed up my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move steady, controlled, like I hadn't noticed. My car was 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. Then, a shadow broke from the cars behind me, fast. I didn't think. I sprinted. I barely had time to register the sound of heavy boots pounding the pavement behind me before something grabbed the hood of my jacket, yanking me backward. I screamed. Adrenaline flooded my veins as I twisted, throwing my elbow back as hard as I could. It connected with something solid. A chest? A jaw. The grip on my jacket loosened just enough for me to tear away. I stumbled forward, nearly falling against my car. My hands fumbled for the door handle, shaking so hard I could barely grip it. Then a voice, low, rough, right behind me. "Why do you keep running?" I yanked the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut. My trembling fingers hit the lock button just as something slammed against the window. His face, right there, pressed against the glass, staring at me with wild, hungry eyes. His mouth curled into a grin, wrong, stretched too wide. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I threw the car into reverse and hit the gas. Hard. The tires screeched as I backed out, clipping another car. My stalker stumbled back, his grin vanishing, replaced with something else. Anger. I didn't stop. I didn't care. I hit the gas and sped out of the lot, my entire body shaking. My vision blurred with tears, my chest tight with panic. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest police station. The officers took my report. They checked the hospital cameras, and that's when I learned the worst part. He had been there for weeks, The cameras showed him lurking in the lot almost every night, watching, waiting. They never caught him. I quit my job the next day, moved out of the city within the week. But the fear never left, because I know he's still out there, somewhere. And every time I step outside at night, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I wonder, is he watching me again, waiting for the moment I finally stop running? I should have never opened the door. If I had just ignored the knock, kept the lights off, acted like I wasn't home, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe my life wouldn't have turned into a waking nightmare. But I did open it, and that was the moment everything changed. It was a Friday night in Chicago, and I was home alone in my apartment, drowning in work. Freelance video editing sounded like a dream job, but in reality, it was just endless hours of staring at a screen, fixing someone else's mess. I was starving, exhausted, and too drained to cook. So I grabbed my phone and ordered a burger and fries from a local joint. A simple, normal delivery, except it wasn't. 40 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I got up, stretched, and walked over, barely thinking as I peeked through the peephole. The delivery guy stood there, holding a brown bag. He wore a black hoodie pulled low over his face, his hands stuffed into the sleeves like he was trying to stay warm. Something about him made me hesitate. Maybe it was how still he was. Most drivers checked their phones, shuffled their feet, acted normal. But this guy? He just stood there, waiting. A small, uneasy feeling crept up my spine. But I ignored it. I unlocked the door. He barely looked up as he shoved the bag into my hands. "Order for Jake?" Yeah. I fumbled with my wallet. "Give me a sec." "Already paid." His voice was flat, emotionless. I glanced at his face, but his cap's shadow swallowed most of it. Just the faintest hint of a smirk. Something about it made my stomach knot. I muttered a quick, "Thanks," and shut the door, locking it behind me. The moment he was gone, the apartment felt colder. Shaking off the nerves, I carried the bag to my coffee table and sat down. But the second I set it down, I realized it was too heavy. I frowned. I hadn't ordered much. Maybe they threw in extra fries. I opened the bag, and my blood turned to ice. Inside, there was no food. Instead, there was a thick wad of cash, stacks of $100 bills, bound tightly with a rubber band. Resting beside it, a black handgun, and a small, unmarked package wrapped in plastic. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell? I stared at the bag, my hands going numb. My brain refused to process what I was looking at. This was a mistake. It had to be. I reached for the receipt, praying I'd see a different name, but written in bold letters, clear as day, was my address, and a name I didn't recognize. Jose Gabriel Morales. I barely had time to react before the doorbell rang again. The doorbell rang again. Not a normal ring. Faster, harder, more urgent. My breath hitched. I turned toward the door, my body locking up. No, 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 no. They knew the package was here. I snatched the bag off the table, shoving it under my couch. My mind was racing. Should I call the cops? Pretend I'm not home? Run? Then, bam! A heavy fist slammed against the door so hard that the frame rattled. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A voice, muffled but sharp. "Open up." I backed away, my heart pounding against my ribs. Another bang. Harder this time. "We know you got the delivery," the voice snapped. "Just give us the bag, and this ends here." Lies. Every instinct screamed at me. If I opened that door, I wouldn't be walking away. I turned on my heel and ran. Straight to my bedroom. The second I locked the door, I reached for my phone. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped. I dialed 911. No service. I stared at the screen, my stomach flipping. That didn't make sense. I had service earlier. Were they jamming the signal? Then, The doorknob twisted. Not the bedroom. The front door. They were trying to break in. I scrambled for anything to use as a weapon. Then my eyes landed on the bag under the couch. The gun. I hesitated. I had never even held one before. But right now, it was the only thing between me and whatever was outside that door. I dropped to my knees, yanking the bag free, my pulse hammering in my ears. I grabbed the gun, hands shaking violently as I checked if it was loaded. It was. Then, the sound of splintering wood. My stomach twisted as I heard the door frame crack. I was out of time. I swallowed down my fear, aimed the gun at the door, and waited. Then, bam! The door burst open and two men stepped inside. I didn't think. I just pulled the trigger. The gun kicked back violently, nearly flying out of my hands. My ears rang from the explosion, but I missed. The first man, a burly guy in a dark jacket, lunged the second I fired. Before I could react, his hand slammed into my wrist, knocking the gun loose. It hit the floor with a sickening clatter. The second guy, a tall, wiry man with a shaved head, grabbed my shirt and threw me backward. I crashed against the nightstand, pain exploding through my ribs. My lamp shattered on impact, plunging the room into flickering darkness. Stupid move, the first guy growled. My chest heaved. I could barely think over the sound of my heartbeat slamming in my ears. The wiry man bent down, grabbed the gun, and pointed it at me. "Where's the package?" His voice was cold. Empty. Like he had done this before. I couldn't speak. My mind was spinning too fast, drowning in terror. The first guy grabbed my collar, yanking me up. "We're not asking again. I did the only thing I could." I lied. "It's not here." My voice shook. I didn't order this. Someone must have." A sharp crack echoed in the room as the guy backhanded me across the face. Pain exploded through my jaw. I hit the floor, gasping. I tasted blood. I barely had time to process it before cold metal pressed against my forehead. The gun. The wiry man crouched down, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You got one last chance," he murmured. "Tell us where it is." My pulse pounded so hard it felt like my skull would split. My vision blurred with fear. Then, a sound outside, loud, close. Sirens. For a moment, no one moved. Then, flashing red and blue lights flooded through my window. The men froze. I didn't know who had called them. A neighbor? A passerby? It didn't matter. Because in that split second of hesitation, I kicked out. My foot connected with the gunman's wrist. The gun jerked upward. A deafening shot went off, but it missed. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the way my head spun with pain. I ran, straight for the door. The burly guy lunged after me, but I was already in the hallway. Then, boom! The apartment door exploded inward as the cops stormed in. "Hands up! Get down! Now!" The men barely had time to react before they were tackled to the ground. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my whole body trembling violently. It was over. The cops found the package still under my couch. Turns out it was drugs. A massive amount, packed and ready for distribution. The men? Part of a cartel. They had delivered it to the wrong address. My address. If I had given it to them, they probably would have let me live. But I didn't. And that's why they tried to kill me. The police told me I was lucky to be alive, but lucky wasn't how I felt. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every knock on the door sent ice through my veins. Every shadow outside my window made my stomach drop. I moved out of that apartment, changed my number, started over. But no matter how far I ran, the fear followed. Because I kept thinking about one thing, the delivery guy, the one who brought the package. The cops never found him, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear knocking. There are nights that never leave you. No matter how much time passes, they stick to your memory like a stain you can't wash off. This is one of those nights. I was 17. working the night shift at a roadside diner in Ohio. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place where truckers, late-night travelers, and the occasional drunk college kid would stop for coffee and greasy food. I had taken the job to save money for college, but I quickly learned that the night belongs to strange people. At 1:13 a.m. she walked in. At first glance, she looked like any other exhausted traveler. Late 50s, thin, with a heavy gray coat that swallowed her frame. But something was off. Her hair was tangled, sticking out in wild tufts, and her eyes, they were dark, sunken, hollow. She moved stiffly, her shoulders tense, like she was waiting for something, or someone. She sat at a booth near the window, drumming her long, bony fingers against the tabletop. Tap, tap, tap. There was a sharpness to her movements, a jittery kind of energy that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore her as I refilled the napkin dispensers. But then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. She wasn't looking at the menu. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was staring at me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus on my task. People act weird all the time, especially at this hour. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she was just lonely. Maybe. After a few minutes, she called me over, her voice hoarse like she hadn't spoken in days. "Double cheeseburger," she said. Her lips barely moved. "Extra pickles." I nodded, ringing up her order, trying not to notice how she was still watching me. When the food was ready, I placed the plate in front of her and turned to leave. But she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was ice cold. "These aren't extra pickles," she muttered, her nails digging into my skin. I glanced at the burger. There were plenty of pickles. "I can bring you more." She didn't let go. Her breathing quickened, turning ragged. Her fingers tightened around my wrist, her knuckles turning white. "You're just like the rest of them," she whispered. My stomach twisted. "Them?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just started smiling. That smile. It wasn't right. It stretched too wide, pulling at the corners of her mouth, revealing yellowed teeth and gums that looked too pale. My instincts screamed at me to pull away, but I froze. Then, her grip tightened. I jerked my arm back, and she finally let go, but not before dragging her nails along my wrist, leaving thin red scratches. I stumbled backward, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Ma'am, I'll grab those pickles for you," I muttered, my voice shaking. I turned toward the kitchen, but I barely made it a step before I heard it, the sharp screech of a chair dragging against the floor. I turned just in time to see her swinging something at me. Crack. White-hot pain exploded in my skull as the tray she had grabbed from the table slammed into the side of my head. The force knocked me off my feet, and I hit the cold tile floor hard. My vision blurred, but I could hear the diner erupt into chaos. Shouts, chairs scraping, someone screaming. My heart pounded as I struggled to get up, but before I could even lift myself onto my elbows, she was on me. Her nails tore into my skin. I barely had time to react before she raked them down my face, her jagged, uneven nails splitting my cheek open like claws. I screamed, kicking wildly, trying to push her off, but she was stronger than she looked, much stronger. "Do you think you're better than me?" she shrieked. Her voice was different now, higher, raw, animalistic. I threw my arm up to protect myself, but she lunged forward and sank her teeth into my forearm. The pain was instant. A sharp, burning agony shot through my arm as I felt her teeth break the skin, sinking deep, too deep. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I thrashed beneath her. She didn't let go. I could feel her jaw clenching tighter, her teeth grinding into my flesh, pulling, tearing. My vision swam with black spots. She was trying to rip off a piece of me. With a final, desperate effort, I used my free hand to grab a metal napkin dispenser from the floor and slammed it against the side of her head. Thud. She reeled back with a choked, guttural sound, her mouth finally releasing my arm. Blood poured from the wound, soaking my sleeve, my own blood. I scrambled backward on my hands, gasping for air, but she just sat there, swaying slightly, her mouth open, glistening with red. Then she did something that made my stomach turn to ice. She licked her lips. And then she started laughing. The sound of her laughter sent a sickening chill through my bones. It wasn't normal. It wasn't even human. It was a dry, cracked giggle, like something trying to remember how to laugh. I pressed my hand to my arm, warm blood pooling between my fingers, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. She wasn't done. She staggered to her feet, swaying like a puppet with its strings cut. Her head tilted slightly, eyes locked onto me with something hungry. The laughter stopped just as suddenly as it had started. Then she lunged. I barely had time to react before she was on me again, clawing at my face, reaching for my throat. Her fingers curled around my neck, squeezing. I gasped, my vision tunneling. Dark spots danced at the edges of my eyes. I did the only thing I could. I lashed out blindly, grabbing whatever was closest. My fingers wrapped around something cold and solid. A metal serving tray. With the last bit of strength I had left, I swung it as hard as I could. Crack! The impact sent her stumbling back, knocking over a chair as she hit the floor. But she was still moving. I scrambled to my feet, blood rushing in my ears. She was crawling toward me now, her fingers digging into the tile, dragging herself forward, leaving a trail of blood behind her. But it wasn't mine. I took another step back, feeling the counter against my spine. There was nowhere left to go. Where the hell was everyone? Why wasn't anyone helping me? Then, through the chaos, I heard it. Sirens. Blue and red lights flashed against the diner windows, and within seconds the front door burst open. 2 police officers stormed in, guns drawn. "Get down!" one of them shouted. But she didn't stop. She turned her head toward them, that same sick smile stretched across her face. There was no fear in her eyes. I barely had time to register. What happened next? Bang! The first shot rang out, echoing through the diner. Bang! Bang! Her body jerked with each impact before finally slumping to the floor, motionless. Silence. I stood there, shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The officers rushed forward, one checking for a pulse, the other speaking into his radio. I watched from where I stood, frozen, my brain trying to catch up to what had just happened. And then, she twitched. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, her head jerking slightly. Her fingers curled against the tile like she was still trying to crawl toward me. Even as her body failed, even as the blood pooled beneath her, she was still trying. And then, finally, she stopped. The officer beside me exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus Christ. The paramedics arrived minutes later, tending to my wounds as I sat in a daze. I could hear the cops talking in hushed voices, but my ears were ringing too much to make sense of it. I glanced toward the stretcher where they were loading her up. For a moment, I thought I saw it again. That twisted, hungry smile. I blinked. Her face was blank. Empty. But I still feel it. To this day, I can't eat at diners. I can't handle the sound of nails tapping against a table. Because every now and then, when it's late at night, when I'm alone, I swear I can hear that laugh. There's something unsettling about working the night shift. It's not just the silence or the flickering fluorescent lights. It's the way the world feels. Different after midnight. Like anything could happen. Like something could be watching. I managed a 24-hour gas station in Indiana. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and high school kids loitered in the parking lot. I wasn't supposed to be working that night. My coworker had called in sick, so I had to cover. If I had known what would happen, I never would have walked through those doors. It started at 9 p.m. A blue sedan rolled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A man stepped out, middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing jeans and a gray hoodie. He looked normal, but the moment he walked in, I felt it. Something wasn't right. At first, he just browsed, picked up a few snacks, glanced at the drinks. But every so often I caught him watching Megan, my cashier. Not in a casual way, in a way that made my skin crawl. Megan laughed it off when I asked her about it. "Creeps come in all the time," she whispered. Nothing new. But something about this guy felt worse. I kept an eye on him, pretending to organize the cigarette rack behind the counter. But then, he looked at me, dead in the eyes. A slow, creeping smile spread across his face like he knew I was watching, like he had been waiting for me to notice him. I clenched my jaw, keeping my expression neutral. "You need help with something?" He didn't answer. He just kept smiling. A few seconds passed before he turned away, casually strolling toward the back of the store, toward the employee-only door. My stomach twisted. I stepped out from behind the counter, my heart hammering. "Sir, that area's off limits." He ignored me. I took a step closer. "Sir." He turned suddenly, fast, and I saw it. His pupils were blown wide, black swallowing the color of his eyes. "You're hiding something back there," he murmured. My breath caught in my throat. "What?" Before I could respond, he lunged for the door handle. I moved fast, but he moved faster. His fingers clawed at the handle, yanking at it like a rabid animal trying to break through a locked cage. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, but the moment I touched him, he snapped. He spun on me, shoving me back so hard I nearly fell into a shelf. "Get off me!" he shrieked, his voice raw, frantic. Spit flew from his mouth. Megan screamed, "Adam!" My other employee ran out from behind the counter. "Back the hell up, man." The stranger didn't listen. His breathing turned ragged, erratic. He took a step toward me, hands shaking, his pupils so wide his eyes looked black. "What are you hiding?" he hissed. My blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" I shot back, his lip curled into a sneer. He wasn't just some random creep. He was convinced. No, he knew. There was something behind that door, and then he reached into his hoodie. My stomach dropped. "Get away from him!" Adam roared, charging forward. But the guy was fast. In one sudden movement, he whipped something out of his pocket. I saw the glint of metal. A knife. Adam grabbed his wrist before he could swing. They struggled, knocking over a display of chips, sending bags scattering across the floor. Megan was sobbing now, hands over her mouth. "Call the cops!" I yelled, but I didn't know if she even heard me. I lunged forward, grabbing the guy from behind, wrapping my arms around his chest. He thrashed violently, his head slamming back into my face. Pain exploded in my nose. I lost my grip for half a second, but that was all he needed. With a sickening grunt, he yanked himself free and turned toward me, the knife raised. I saw his eyes then, really saw them, not rage, not panic, hunger, and then he swung. I threw myself back just in time. The blade slashed the air inches from my gut. My pulse slammed against my skull as I staggered away, my shoes slipping on scattered chip bags. He was going to kill me. Adam charged again, but the guy was a wild animal now. He spun and punched Adam square in the jaw, knocking him to the ground. Megan let out a raw, panicked scream, her fingers fumbling with the store phone. The stranger turned back to me, knife trembling in his grip. "You're all in." "On it," he hissed. "You think I don't know? I saw it." My mind reeled. What was he talking about? What the hell did he think we were hiding? Then, he lunged. I had no choice. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a metal flashlight from the counter, and I swung. With everything I had. Crack. The sound of metal on bone was sickening. The guy stumbled sideways, his body hitting the cold tile with a heavy thud. The knife clattered from his fingers. For a second, everything went dead silent. The only sound was my own breath, ragged and shaky, as I stared down at his unmoving body. Then, the sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the store windows. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Step away from him, hands up!" I backed away, hands trembling in the air as police stormed inside. They pinned him down, cuffed him, but he didn't fight back. He just laid there, breathing heavy. And then, Just as they were hauling him to his feet, he turned his head toward me, his face twisted into something wrong, and he smiled. "You should have let me open the door," he rasped. A chill ripped through my spine. Even as the cops dragged him outside, even as the store filled with the chaos of people shouting, I couldn't move. I turned, eyes landing on the employee-only door. My stomach twisted. It was still slightly open. I must have left it that way earlier when I checked inventory. Just enough for someone to peek inside. What the hell did he see? With shaking hands, I reached forward and pushed the door open. The storage room looked exactly the same as it always did. Shelves, boxes, extra stock, nothing unusual. But then, my breath caught. In the farthest corner of the room, the freezer door was open, the one I always kept locked, and inside, just barely visible in the dim light, a handprint, a single, bloody handprint smeared across the metal. I staggered back, my heart hammering. The cops were still outside, loading the guy into the squad car. I could see him through the windshield. He wasn't screaming or struggling anymore. He was still smiling, like he knew something I didn't. And maybe he did. The first time I saw him, I felt something was off. It was a cold November night in Denver, and I had barely eaten all day. I was drained, mentally and physically, after another brutal shift editing videos for clients who thought they were the center of the universe. My fridge was empty, unless I wanted to survive on ketchup packets and expired yogurt. So I did what any exhausted person would do. I ordered a pizza. The delivery estimate was 40 minutes. 35 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Too soon. I hesitated before getting up from the couch. I hadn't even received the usual "your driver is on the way" notification. A small, uneasy feeling curled in my stomach. I walked to the door, checking the peephole. The guy standing outside was wrong. Tall and thin, almost gaunt, with a stained red uniform that looked like it had been crumpled on his floor for weeks. His baseball cap sat low over his eyes, casting a shadow over most of his face. His posture was rigid, stiff, like he didn't belong in his own skin. He wasn't holding a pizza. For a moment I just stood there frozen. Then, slowly, he lifted a hand and knocked again. Something about the way he did it, deliberate, methodical, like he was testing my patience, sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed, trying to shake off the creeping dread, and cracked the door open just enough to see him properly. Hey, you got my order?" My voice came out weaker than I intended. His lips stretched into a grin. Not a friendly one. "Of course," he said. His voice was flat, monotone, as if he were reading from a script. Then, after a pause, he added, "Nice house." That made my stomach tighten. I glanced past him. The street was dead. No headlights, no movement. My porch light flickered slightly, casting long, sharp shadows across his face. Why did he say that? I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. Thanks. So, the pizza?" For a moment he just stood there, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. Then, finally, he reached into the insulated delivery bag and pulled out the box. His hands lingered on it a little too long before handing it over. When I took it, it was ice cold. Something in my gut twisted. "Hey, man," I forced a casual tone. "This isn't fresh. You just get here. Or..." His smile widened. "Traffic," he said simply. That was a lie. I hadn't heard a single car. I shoved some cash into his hand just to get him away from my door. He didn't even look at the money. He just stared at me, like he was memorizing my face. "Have a good night," he finally said, backing away way too slowly. I shut the door the second he stepped off my porch, locking it. My pulse was hammering. I wasn't sure why I felt so on edge, but I did. I wasn't hungry anymore. Still, I placed the pizza box on my table and lifted the lid. Inside was a completely burnt pizza, blackened, inedible. and something else. A note, written in messy, smudged ink. You can't hide forever. I dropped the lid. The air in my apartment suddenly felt too thick, like the walls were closing in. I rushed back to the door and yanked it open. He was gone, not walking down the street, not getting into a car, just gone. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't over. Sleep never came that night. I sat on my couch, every light in my apartment on, the burnt pizza untouched on the table. My brain kept looping over every detail, his face, his voice, the way he stood just a little too close. And that note. You can't hide forever. I told myself it was a mistake, a joke, maybe a mix-up, but deep down, I knew better. By 3 a.m. exhaustion started to pull at me, so I forced myself to bed. Still, I locked my bedroom door, just in case. Sometime later, I woke up with a jolt. Something wasn't right. The room was silent. My bedside clock blinked 4:12 a.m. in angry red numbers. I rubbed my face trying to shake off the haze, but then I heard it. A faint tapping. My pulse slowed. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a tree branch against the window. Then it happened again. Tap. 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 I held my breath. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like a signal, like someone was waiting for me to notice. I turned my head toward the window, my stomach twisting into knots. The blinds were closed, but something about the darkness beyond them felt heavy, like it wasn't empty. Slowly, as if moving too fast would trigger something horrible, I slipped out of bed and crossed the room. My fingers trembled as I reached for the blinds. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought if I saw nothing, I could shake the fear and finally sleep. I was wrong. I lifted the blinds just an inch, just enough to see outside, and I stopped breathing. He was there, standing inches from the glass, staring at me with that same twisted grin, my body locked up, my throat closing in pure terror. His breath fogged against the glass, his eyes wide, almost hungry. His uniform looked dirtier now, his cap slightly askew. He hadn't left. He had been watching me, waiting. I stumbled back, slamming into the nightstand, knocking over a lamp. The crash was deafening in the silence. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, slowly he lifted his hand and pointed at me. Not at the window, not at the room. At me. I scrambled for my phone with shaking hands, dialing 911 so fast I nearly dropped it. 911, what's your emergency? I turned back to the window. He was gone. Just like before, no sound, no movement. The street outside was empty, silent. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the phone like a lifeline. My name is Ethan Carter, I stammered, my voice shaking. I think someone is stalking me. The dispatcher kept me on the line as I stumbled through my apartment, checking every lock, every window. My skin was ice cold, my hands slick with sweat. 2 patrol cars arrived in under 10 minutes, their flashing lights painting my walls in erratic streaks of red and blue. I met them at the door, my voice barely steady as I explained what had happened. The burnt pizza, the note, the man at my window. The officers swept the perimeter, checked the street, even knocked on a few doors. Nothing. No footprints in the damp grass. No sign of forced entry. No security footage from nearby apartments that showed anyone leaving. Like he was never there at all. One of the officers, a stocky guy named Officer Daniels, studied me with careful eyes. You sure you weren't dreaming? I felt something, hot and ugly, rise in my throat. I wasn't dreaming, I snapped. He was standing right there. I stopped, because out of the corner of my eye I saw something tucked beneath my doormat. A note. My blood turned to ice as I crouched down, hands shaking as I unfolded the paper. Only 5 words. You left the blinds open. I swayed on my feet. My stomach lurched. He had been watching. Long before tonight. I shoved the note at Daniels. His expression darkened as he read it, then gestured for his partner. Call it in. We need patrols in this area for the next few nights. I heard them. My ears were ringing, my vision tunneling. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The police kept an eye on my apartment, but nothing happened. No more notes, no more tapping at the window. It should have made me feel safe. It didn't. Because I knew what was really happening. He was waiting. Not gone, not caught, just waiting. For me to let my guard down. For me to forget. And that's the worst part of all. The fear doesn't end. It never ends. Because even now, even in the daylight, even after I moved across the country, sometimes, late at night, I wake, up gasping for air, convinced I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. And when I look at the window, I swear, just for a second, I see a shadow. If you've survived this far and you're one of those who love fear and terror, then don't waste any time. I kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any content. The video you're watching on screen is just a taste of what's coming. Watch it. Thank you for being here, and see you next time, if you're capable of handling what's to come.